The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Prince George walked quietly through the corridors he had known since childhood. At 15, he had grown tall and thoughtful, his father's serious demeanor mixing with his mother's gentle nature. The palace staff moved around him with practiced efficiency, offering respectful nods as he passed. George paused outside the oak-paneled door of his study room, where his tutors would soon arrive for another day of lessons about history, politics, and the weight of his future crown. But today felt different somehow. Through the tall windows he could see the grounds where tourists gathered beyond the gates, their cameras ready to catch any glimpse of royal life. Officer James Mitchell stood at his usual post near the prince's private quarters. At 32, James had served the royal family for 8 years, his military background making him one of the most trusted members of the security team. His dark uniform was pressed to perfection, his posture straight and alert. James took his duty seriously, understanding that protecting the future king was both an honor and an enormous responsibility. The prince noticed James standing there, as he did every morning, silent and watchful. George had often wondered what it must be like to spend entire days standing guard, always alert, never truly able to relax. He had observed James through countless boring diplomatic meetings, formal dinners and endless photo sessions, always present but invisible, part of the background of royal life. Today, George decided to do something he had never done before. Instead of walking past with a simple nod, he stopped directly in front of James. The guard's eyes remained forward, but George could sense his attention. "Good morning, James," the prince said softly, using the guard's first name for the first time. James blinked, surprised to be addressed so personally, but maintained his professional stance. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." George studied the man's face, noticing the small lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and constant vigilance. "Have you eaten breakfast this morning?" The question caught James off guard. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked about his personal needs. "That's very kind of you to ask, sir. I had something early this morning," but George could see something in James's expression, a hesitation that suggested otherwise. The prince had developed a keen ability to read people, a skill his mother had taught him was essential for future leadership. He sensed that James was being polite rather than truthful. "James," George said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I want you to answer honestly. When did you last have a proper meal?" The guard's professional facade wavered slightly. The truth was that James had been working double shifts for the past 3 days. His colleague had fallen ill, and James had volunteered to cover the extra hours without complaint. He had grabbed a piece of toast at 5 in the morning before his shift began, but that was nearly 6 hours ago. "Yesterday evening, sir," James admitted quietly, his training compelling him to be honest when directly questioned by a member of the royal family. George felt a surge of concern and something else, a realization about the human cost of the protection that surrounded him every day. These guards weren't just fixtures of palace life. They were real people with real needs who often sacrificed their own comfort for his family's safety. Without another word, George turned and walked toward the kitchen quarters, leaving James uncertain whether he should follow or maintain his post. The prince moved with purpose through corridors usually reserved for senior staff, his destination clear in his mind. The palace kitchen was a world unto itself, filled with the sounds and smells of meal preparation. Chef Margaret Williams looked up in surprise as Prince George entered her domain. At 55, she had overseen royal meals for nearly 2 decades, but rarely did any family member venture into her kitchen unannounced. "Your Royal Highness," she said, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. "Is there something I can prepare for you?" "Actually, Margaret, I need your help with something important," George said, his voice carrying an urgency that made the chef pay close attention. "Officer Mitchell hasn't eaten properly in days. He's been working extra shifts, and I think he's too professional to ask for help." Margaret's expression immediately softened. She knew James well. He was always polite when he occasionally came to the kitchen for a cup of tea during his breaks. The idea that he had been going without proper meals while protecting the royal family troubled her deeply. "What would you like me to do, sir?" she asked, already moving toward her ingredients. "I want you to prepare a proper breakfast for him," George said. "Something substantial. And Margaret, I want to take it to him myself." The chef paused, understanding the significance of what the prince was asking. It would be highly unusual for a member of the royal family to personally serve a meal to a guard. But she could see the determination in George's young face and recognized something admirable in his concern for others. Right away, "Your Royal Highness," she said, immediately beginning to gather eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and fruit. As she worked, she explained to George what she was preparing, teaching him about the importance of proper nutrition for people who worked physically demanding jobs. George watched intently as Margaret prepared a plate that would have been suitable for any distinguished guest. She arranged everything beautifully, adding a small vase with a single flower from the palace gardens. The gesture was simple but spoke volumes about the respect being shown. "This is perfect," George said, carefully taking the tray. "Thank you, Margaret. This means more than you know." As the prince made his way back through the corridors carrying the breakfast tray, several staff members stopped and stared. Word began to spread quietly through the palace that something unusual was happening. Prince George was breaking protocol in a way that no one had ever seen before. When George rounded the corner and James came into view, still standing at his post with unwavering dedication, the prince felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one breakfast or one guard. This was about recognizing the humanity in everyone who served, about understanding that true leadership meant caring for those who cared for you. James saw the prince approaching with the tray and couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. In his 8 years of service, nothing had prepared him for this moment. James Mitchell felt his heart rate increase as Prince George approached with the breakfast tray. Everything in his training told him this was wrong. Members of the royal family did not serve their guards. The natural order of palace life was being turned upside down, and James wasn't sure how to respond. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice slightly strained. "This is very kind, but I cannot accept this. It wouldn't be proper." George stopped directly in front of him, holding the tray steady. The smell of fresh bacon and eggs filled the air between them, and James's empty stomach betrayed him with a quiet rumble that both of them heard. "James," the prince said firmly but kindly, "you've been protecting me and my family for 8 years. You've stood guard through boring state dinners, long ceremonies, and countless hours when nothing exciting happened at all. You've missed meals, lost sleep, and put our safety before your own comfort. The least I can do is make sure you eat properly." The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, but George could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. James had been taught never to accept personal favors from the royal family, to maintain professional distance, to be invisible when needed. But he was also trained to follow direct orders from his charges, and Prince George was clearly not going to take no for an answer. "Sir, what will the other staff think? What will your parents say if they find out?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George smiled, and for a moment James saw not the future king but a thoughtful teenager who cared about doing the right thing. "They'll think I'm learning to be the kind of leader who notices when people need help. And if they don't understand that, then maybe they need to learn something too." Around the corner, unnoticed by either the prince or the guard, several palace staff members had gathered. Word of George's unusual behavior had spread quickly through the corridors. Chef Margaret watched anxiously, hoping her carefully prepared meal would be accepted. 2 housekeepers peered around doorways, whispering to each other about what they were witnessing. "James," George continued, "I've been watching you work. I've seen how you never complain, never ask for anything, never put yourself first. But I also see that you're human. You get tired, you get hungry, and you deserve to be treated with respect and care." James felt something he had never experienced in his years of royal service. He felt truly seen. For so long he had prided himself on being the perfect guard, the one who never needed anything, who could endure any hardship without complaint. But standing there, facing this young prince who had noticed his sacrifice, he felt a wave of emotion that threatened to break his professional composure. "I have an idea," George said, seeing James's continued hesitation. "You can't abandon your post, I understand that. But you can eat while you work. I'll stay here with you and make sure no one thinks you're being unprofessional." Before James could protest further, George carefully set the tray on a nearby console table and pulled up a chair for the guard. The gesture was so simple yet so revolutionary within the context of palace protocol. "Please," George said, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't just a request, it was an order from someone who would one day be king. James slowly relaxed his rigid posture and looked directly at the prince for the first time in their conversation. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. This is more kindness than I deserve. Everyone deserves kindness. James, that's something I'm still learning. But I think it might be the most important lesson of all. As James finally accepted the plate and began to eat, George sat beside him, creating one of the most unusual scenes in recent palace history. The future King of England was sharing breakfast with his guard, treating him not as a servant but as a valued human being. The food was excellent, as expected from Chef Margaret's kitchen. But what struck James most was the conversation that followed. George asked about his family, his background, his experiences in the military before joining the Royal Guard. For the first time in 8 years, James was able to speak as himself, rather than as an extension of palace security. "I have a daughter," James found himself saying, between bites of perfectly prepared eggs. "She's 7 years old. She thinks I work for superheroes because I'm always telling her I protect very important people." George laughed, a genuine sound that echoed off the corridor walls. "Well, she's not entirely wrong. Though I think the real superhero here is you. I couldn't do what I'm supposed to do without people like you making sure I'm safe." The conversation continued as James finished his meal. And with each passing minute, something fundamental was changing between them. The rigid hierarchy that had always defined their relationship was softening into something more human, more real. From her hiding spot around the corner, Chef Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She had worked in the palace long enough to understand how rare and precious this moment was. She quietly signaled to the other staff members to give the prince and guard privacy. But word was already spreading throughout the palace about George's extraordinary act of kindness. In the security office, Sergeant David Collins received a radio call from another guard about the unusual situation developing in the East Wing. As head of palace security, David felt a moment of panic. Protocol was being broken and he wasn't sure how to handle it. "Should I intervene, sir?" asked the guard on the radio. David paused, considering his options. He could march over there and restore proper protocol, ensuring that the natural order was maintained. But something in the description of what was happening made him hesitate. Prince George wasn't being reckless or dangerous, he was being kind. "Continue monitoring from a distance," David finally said into his radio. "Do not interfere unless there's an actual security concern." Back in the corridor, George and James had finished their impromptu breakfast meeting. James stood and resumed his formal posture, but something had changed in his demeanor. He looked more relaxed, more human, despite returning to his professional duties. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This meant more to me than you could possibly know." George stood as well, collecting the empty tray. "No, James, thank you. For everything you do, everything you sacrifice. I promise I'll never forget this conversation." As the prince walked away, carrying the tray back to the kitchen, James felt a profound shift in how he viewed his role. He was still a guard, still dedicated to protecting the royal family, but now he also felt valued, seen, and respected as a person. The news of what had happened would soon reach every corner of the palace, creating ripples that would change everything. Word spread through Kensington Palace like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations between housekeepers, quiet discussions among kitchen staff, and hushed reports between security personnel. By afternoon, everyone from the head butler to the newest cleaning lady knew about Prince George's remarkable gesture toward Officer Mitchell. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was reviewing her schedule for the upcoming week when her private secretary, Emma Thompson, approached with an unusual expression on her face. "Your Royal Highness," Emma began carefully, "there's something I think you should know about Prince George this morning." Catherine looked up from her papers, immediately alert. As a mother, she had developed an instinct for detecting when something significant had happened with her children. "What is it? Is he all right?" Emma smiled, which immediately relieved Catherine's initial worry. "He's perfectly fine, ma'am. In fact, he did something quite extraordinary. He personally served breakfast to one of his guards, Officer Mitchell, after noticing the man hadn't eaten properly in days." Catherine set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, processing this information. She felt a surge of pride mixed with slight concern about protocol implications. "Tell me exactly what happened." As Emma recounted the morning's events in detail, Catherine found herself smiling. This was exactly the kind of empathy and leadership she and William had tried to instill in their children. George was learning to see beyond his privileged position and recognize the humanity in everyone around him. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Prince William was having a similar conversation with his equerry, Major Robert Hayes. The future king listened intently as Robert described the unprecedented scene that had unfolded in the East Corridor. "The staff are talking about nothing else, sir," Robert concluded. "It's clear that Prince George made quite an impression on everyone who witnessed it." William felt a complex mix of emotions. As a father, he was incredibly proud of his son's compassion and initiative. As a future king, he understood the delicate balance required in royal protocol and staff relationships. But ultimately, he knew that George had done exactly what a good leader should do. He had noticed someone in need and acted to help them. In the security office, the atmosphere was tense. Sergeant David Collins called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss the morning's events and their implications for palace protocol. "Gentlemen," David began, addressing the 5 senior guards gathered around the conference table, "we need to discuss what happened this morning with Prince George and Officer Mitchell." The guards exchanged glances, unsure of where this conversation was heading. They all respected James Mitchell as a colleague and had heard about the prince's kind gesture, but they also understood the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. "Sir," said Officer Thomas Wright, a veteran guard with 15 years of service, "if I may speak freely, what Prince George did was extraordinary. James has been working double shifts without complaint, and none of us realized how much he was sacrificing." David nodded slowly. "That's exactly the point, Thomas. We're so focused on our duties that we sometimes forget to take care of each other. Maybe there's a lesson here for all of us." Back in his quarters, James Mitchell sat alone during his lunch break, still processing the morning's events. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Prince George, the genuine concern in the young man's voice, and the simple human connection they had shared over breakfast. His phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, Sarah. "How's your day going? Hope you're taking care of yourself." For the first time in months, James smiled as he typed his response. "Actually, someone took care of me today. I'll tell you about it when I get home." James thought about his 7-year-old daughter, Lucy, and how proud she would be to know that the prince she imagined as a superhero had shown such kindness to her father. It would be a story he could tell her that would reinforce her belief in the goodness of people. In the palace kitchen, Chef Margaret was preparing for the evening meal when several of her staff approached her with unusual requests. "Chef," said sous chef Peter Mills, "would it be possible to prepare some extra sandwiches for the security staff? After what happened this morning, we've been thinking about how hard they work and how they sometimes miss proper meal times." Margaret's face lit up with understanding. Prince George's act of kindness was creating a ripple effect throughout the palace community. "That's a wonderful idea, Peter. Let's make sure everyone who works here feels valued and cared for." As the afternoon progressed, more stories began to emerge about small acts of kindness happening throughout the palace. Housekeepers were checking on each other more frequently. Kitchen staff were making sure security guards had access to hot drinks during long shifts, and maintenance workers were receiving acknowledgement for their contributions to palace life. In his study, Prince George was trying to focus on his history lesson about parliamentary democracy, but his tutor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, noticed his distraction. "Your Royal Highness," she said gently, "you seem preoccupied today. Is there something on your mind?" George looked up from his textbook, considering whether to share what had happened. Dr. Hartwell had been his tutor for 3 years, and had always encouraged him to think critically about leadership and responsibility. "Dr. Hartwell," he began slowly, "this morning I did something that I think might have broken some rules, but I believe it was the right thing to do." The tutor set aside her lesson plan and gave George her full attention. "Tell me about it." As George described his interaction with Officer Mitchell, Dr. Hartwell found herself impressed by the young prince's thoughtfulness and moral reasoning. When he finished, she smiled warmly. "Your Royal Highness, what you did this morning demonstrates the kind of leadership that people will remember long after political speeches are forgotten. You saw a need and responded with compassion. That's not breaking rules. That's making better ones." George felt a wave of relief and validation. He had worried that his parents or other adults might view his actions as inappropriate or naive. But Dr. Hartwell's response confirmed what his heart had told him, that treating people with kindness and respect was never wrong. Do you think it will cause problems? George asked. Change often does cause some discomfort initially, Dr. Hartwell replied thoughtfully. But the best leaders throughout history have been those who challenged existing systems when those systems failed to serve human dignity. What you did today honored the humanity of someone who serves your family faithfully. As evening approached, the palace settled into its usual routines, but there was an undercurrent of something different in the air. Staff members seemed more connected to each other, more aware of their shared humanity despite their different roles and ranks. Officer Mitchell resumed his evening shift with a renewed sense of purpose. He stood at his post with the same professional dedication as always, but now he also felt valued as a person, not just as a function of palace security. The day's events had set something in motion that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come. Prince George's simple act of kindness had planted seeds of change that would grow into something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. As the palace lights dimmed and most of the staff headed home to their families, the story of what had happened that morning continued to spread beyond the palace walls, carrying with it a message about the power of compassion and the importance of seeing the person behind every role. 3 days after the breakfast incident, Prince William requested a private meeting with his son. They met in William's study, a room lined with books about history, politics, and leadership. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows as father and son sat across from each other in comfortable leather chairs. George, William began, his tone serious but warm. I've been hearing some interesting stories about your activities this week. George straightened in his chair, unsure whether he was about to be praised or reprimanded. Yes, father. William studied his son's face, seeing both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. What you did for Officer Mitchell was remarkable. Your mother and I are very proud of the compassion you showed. Relief flooded George's features. I was worried you might think I overstepped boundaries. There's a difference between breaking rules and breaking barriers, William explained. You broke down barriers that perhaps should never have existed in the first place. Tell me, how do you feel about what happened? George considered the question carefully. It felt right, father. James has been protecting our family for years, and I realized I didn't know anything about him as a person. That seemed wrong to me. William nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that will make you a good king someday. The crown doesn't separate us from humanity. It should connect us more deeply to it. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Come in, William called. Catherine entered, followed by a woman neither George nor William recognized immediately. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a nervous smile, dressed in her best clothes. I hope I'm not interrupting, Catherine said, but there's someone here who wanted to meet Prince George. The woman stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Your Royal Highness, she said to George, I'm Sarah Mitchell, James's wife. I hope it's all right that I came. George stood immediately, surprised but pleased. Of course, Mrs. Mitchell, please sit down. As Sarah took a seat, she pulled out her phone and showed them a photo of a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. This is Lucy, our daughter. She's 7 years old and she has something she wanted me to tell you. Sarah's voice became emotional as she continued. Lucy said that if a real prince was kind to her daddy, then maybe all the fairy tales are true and there really are good people who care about others. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. This was exactly the kind of impact she had hoped her children would have on the world, inspiring others to believe in goodness and kindness. Mrs. Mitchell, George said softly, your husband is one of the bravest, most dedicated people I know. I should have thanked him properly long ago. Sarah wiped away a tear. You gave him something he's never had in his years of service. You made him feel valued as a person. When he came home that day, he was different, happier, more proud of his work than I'd seen him in years. William exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. They were witnessing their son's first real experience of how leadership actions create ripple effects far beyond their immediate scope. There's something else, Sarah continued, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a hand-drawn picture and offered it to George. Lucy made this for you. The drawing showed a tall figure in a crown standing next to a shorter figure in what appeared to be a uniform. Between them was a table with food, and above them Lucy had written in careful child's handwriting, Thank you for being nice to my daddy. George studied the drawing with genuine appreciation. This is beautiful. May I keep it? She was hoping you would, Sarah smiled. She also wanted me to ask if you like chocolate chip cookies because she wants to learn how to make some for you." The innocence and sincerity of the gesture touched everyone in the room. George looked at his parents, then back at Sarah. "I love chocolate chip cookies. Would it be possible for Lucy to visit the palace kitchen sometime? Chef Margaret could teach her some baking techniques." Sarah's eyes widened in amazement. "You would really do that?" "Of course," George said. "Any daughter of Officer Mitchell is welcome here." After Sarah left, the family sat together discussing the profound impact of George's simple act of kindness. They talked about how leadership wasn't just about making policy decisions or attending state functions. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone and using position and privilege to uplift others. Meanwhile, throughout the palace, the changes that had begun with a breakfast tray continued to unfold. The security team had implemented a new system ensuring that guards working double shifts received proper meal breaks. Chef Margaret had established a program providing snacks and hot drinks to all staff working long hours. Most significantly, the rigid social barriers that had traditionally separated different levels of palace staff were beginning to soften. Conversations were happening across departments, with people learning each other's names and stories for the first time in years. Officer Mitchell noticed these changes most acutely. His colleagues treated him differently now, not because he had received special attention from Prince George, but because the entire culture of the palace was shifting toward greater mutual respect and recognition. During his evening rounds, James encountered Sergeant Collins, who stopped him for an unexpected conversation. "James," Collins said, "I've been thinking about what happened this week. I realize that I've been so focused on security protocols that I've forgotten to check on the well-being of my team." "How are you holding up with all the extra shifts?" The question surprised James. In all his years of service, his supervisor had never asked about his personal welfare. "I'm managing fine, sir, but I appreciate you asking. From now on, we're going to make sure no one works more than 2 consecutive double shifts without proper rest," Collins said. "Prince George showed us something important about taking care of the people who take care of others." That same evening, George was in his room when he received an unexpected visitor. Chef Margaret knocked on his door, carrying a small plate covered with a cloth napkin. "Your Royal Highness," she said with a warm smile, "I thought you might enjoy these." She lifted the cloth to reveal perfectly baked chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. "I used Lucy Mitchell's favorite recipe. Her mother shared it with me when she visited today." George accepted the cookies gratefully, but what struck him most was the connection being made. Through his simple act of kindness toward Officer Mitchell, he had somehow brought together a 7-year-old girl's love of baking, a dedicated guards family, and the royal kitchen staff. "Chef Margaret," George said, "would you teach me how to make these? I'd like to have the recipe so I can share it with Lucy when she visits." Margaret's face lit up with delight. "It would be my honor, Your Royal Highness." As George bit into one of Lucy's favorite cookies, he reflected on how one breakfast tray had created connections and changes throughout the palace community. He was beginning to understand that true leadership meant creating environments where everyone could flourish, where kindness was valued as much as duty, and where every person's contribution was recognized and appreciated. The ripple effects of that morning continued to spread, reaching into every corner of palace life and beyond, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of humanity can create the most profound transformations. 2 weeks had passed since the breakfast incident, and the palace buzzed with an energy that staff members said they had never experienced before. The changes that began with Prince George's kindness toward Officer Mitchell had grown into something much larger, a transformation of the entire palace culture. However, not everyone was pleased with these developments. Lord Pemberton, the palace's master of protocol, was a man who had served the royal family for 35 years and believed deeply in maintaining traditional hierarchies and boundaries. He had been away on official business during the initial incident, but returned to find what he considered chaos, disrupting the proper order of palace life. On a gray Monday morning, Lord Pemberton requested an urgent meeting with Prince William. His formal demeanor and stiff posture made it clear that he was deeply troubled by what he had observed upon his return. "Your Royal Highness," Pemberton began, settling into his chair across from William's desk, "I must express my serious concerns about recent developments in palace management and protocol." William set aside the documents he had been reviewing and gave Pemberton his full attention. What specifically concerns you, Lord Pemberton? Sir? In my absence, it appears that proper boundaries between the royal family and staff have been significantly compromised. I've witnessed guards chatting casually with housekeepers, kitchen staff wandering freely through corridors typically reserved for senior personnel, and most troubling of all, reports that Prince George has been personally serving meals to security officers. Pemberton's voice carried the weight of decades of tradition and his genuine belief that these changes threatened the very foundation of royal protocol. Such informality undermines the respect and reverence that has sustained the monarchy for centuries. William listened carefully, understanding Pemberton's perspective, while also recognizing the value in what his son had initiated. Lord Pemberton, I appreciate your dedication to protocol and tradition. However, I'd like you to consider that respect and reverence might be enhanced, not diminished when they arise from genuine human connection rather than mere formality. But sir, Pemberton continued, his distress evident, if we allow such casual interactions to continue, where does it end? Will we next have members of the royal family eating in the servants' quarters? Will formal state dinners become casual gatherings? The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Catherine entered, followed by a young man in military dress uniform whom William didn't immediately recognize. I'm sorry to interrupt, Catherine said, but there's someone here who specifically asked to speak with both of you about recent events. The young man stepped forward and saluted crisply. Your Royal Highnesses, I'm Lieutenant Colonel David Hughes, recently returned from deployment in Afghanistan. I'm Officer Mitchell's former commanding officer from his military service. William gestured for Hughes to sit down, curious about this unexpected visit. What brings you here, Colonel? Sir, I learned about what Prince George did for James Mitchell, and I felt compelled to share something important. During our deployment, Sergeant Mitchell, as he was then, saved the lives of 6 soldiers during an ambush. He put himself in extreme danger to ensure his men got out safely. Hughes paused, his emotions evident. James never talks about his military service or his decorations. He's one of the most selfless people I've ever known. When I heard that a member of the royal family finally recognized his character and treated him with the respect he deserves, I knew I had to come here. Lord Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This information cast the recent events in a different light, one that was harder to dismiss as mere protocol violation. There's more, Hughes continued. James refused a promotion that would have taken him away from palace duty because he felt loyal to your family. He's turned down higher-paying security positions with private companies because he believes in serving the crown. The man has given everything to his duty. William felt a surge of pride in his son's intuitive understanding of character. George had somehow recognized James's exceptional nature without knowing any of these details about his background. Colonel Hughes, William said, thank you for sharing this information. It confirms what we already suspected, that Prince George showed excellent judgment in recognizing Officer Mitchell's character. After Hughes left, Lord Pemberton sat quietly for several minutes, clearly struggling with the new information. Finally he spoke. Your Royal Highness, I may have been too hasty in my concerns. If Officer Mitchell is indeed a decorated war hero who has shown such dedication to your family, then perhaps Prince George's gesture was more appropriate than I initially thought. Lord Pemberton, William said gently, I think there's something larger at work here. George didn't know about James's military service or his sacrifices. He simply saw a person who needed care and responded with kindness. That's the kind of leadership I want to see from the future king. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, George was having his own challenging conversation. News of the changes at Kensington Palace had reached other royal households, and his grandmother's equerry had arranged a video call to discuss the situation. George, came the voice through the computer screen, I understand you've been making quite an impression at Kensington Palace. Yes, ma'am, George replied respectfully, unsure whether he was about to be praised or criticized. Tell me about your thinking behind these recent actions. George took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. I realized that I was surrounded by people who were making sacrifices for my family, but I didn't really know them as people. That seemed wrong to me. If someone is willing to risk their safety to protect me, shouldn't I at least care about their well-being? There was a long pause before the response came. That's very thoughtful reasoning, George. Continue. I think being royal should mean setting an example of how to treat people with kindness and respect, especially those who serve others. If we only care about protocol and tradition but ignore the humanity of the people around us, then what kind of leaders are we really? Another pause, then, George, you sound very much like your great-grandfather in his wisdom. He always said that the crown's greatest power was not in commanding obedience but in inspiring others to be their best selves. It seems you've discovered that truth on your own. George felt a wave of relief and validation. Thank you, ma'am. I was worried that I might have caused problems. On the contrary, you may have solved some problems that we didn't even realize existed. I've been hearing reports from other royal residences about staff morale and the importance of recognizing everyone's contributions. Your actions have started conversations that were long overdue. That afternoon, George received an unexpected invitation to join his father for a walk through the palace gardens. As they strolled among the carefully maintained flower beds and ancient trees, William shared his own experiences of learning to balance tradition with progress. When I was your age, William said, I sometimes felt trapped by protocol and expectations. I worried that being royal meant I could never have authentic relationships with anyone. George listened intently as his father continued. But I learned that the most effective leaders throughout history have been those who found ways to honor tradition while still adapting to changing times and human needs. They paused beside a fountain where palace staff often took their breaks. George noticed that the area had been recently improved with new benches and a small shelter, changes that had been made in response to the increased attention being paid to staff comfort and well-being. Father, George said, do you think what I did was right even if it upset some people? William turned to face his son directly. George, leadership often means making decisions that upset some people while helping others. The question isn't whether everyone approves, but whether your actions align with your values and serve the greater good. I keep thinking about James and how he's been protecting us for 8 years, but I never really saw him until that morning. How many other people are there that I'm not seeing? That's exactly the right question to ask, William replied with pride. And the fact that you're asking it tells me you're going to be an exceptional king someday. As they completed their walk, George felt a growing sense of confidence in his choices and a clearer understanding of the kind of leader he wanted to become. The conversations with Lord Pemberton, his grandmother's representative, and now his father had all reinforced that his instincts about treating people with dignity and respect were not just personal preferences, but essential leadership qualities. Back in the palace, the positive changes continued to multiply. Officer Mitchell had become something of an informal liaison between the security team and other staff members, helping to facilitate better communication and mutual support. His military leadership experience proved valuable in fostering teamwork across different departments. Chef Margaret had established a mentorship program, pairing experienced kitchen staff with newer employees, ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and supported. The program had already improved both job satisfaction and the quality of meals served throughout the palace. Even the housekeeping staff had organized themselves more effectively, with senior members. 6 weeks after the breakfast incident, an unexpected crisis would test everything that Prince George had learned about leadership and the strength of the relationships he had built within the palace community. It began on a quiet Tuesday morning when Officer Mitchell arrived for his shift, looking unusually distressed. His normally impeccable uniform was slightly wrinkled and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. George noticed immediately as he passed through the corridor on his way to morning lessons. James, George called softly, approaching his friend. Over the weeks, their relationship had evolved from formal Royal Guard interaction to something approaching genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and understanding. Mitchell straightened automatically but couldn't quite hide his emotional state. Good morning, Your Royal Highness, and James, what's wrong? George asked directly, his voice full of concern. For a moment, Mitchell hesitated, the old protocols warring with the new relationship they had built. Finally, his composure cracked slightly. It's my daughter, sir. Lucy is in the hospital. She collapsed at school yesterday and the doctors aren't sure what's wrong yet. George felt his heart sink. He remembered Lucy's drawing, her innocent message about fairy tales and good people, and her dream of making chocolate chip cookies. The 7-year-old had become real to him through her father's stories and her mother's visit. James, you should be with your family. Not here, George said immediately. Sir, I can't abandon my post. We're already short-staffed, and my duty is to protect you and your family. George saw the internal conflict playing out on Mitchell's face, the dedicated soldier fighting against the worried father. It was exactly the kind of situation that the old palace culture would have handled, by expecting personal sacrifice for duty. But George knew that approach was wrong. James, your duty right now is to be with Lucy and Sarah. That's an order. Before Mitchell could protest further, George was already moving, his mind racing with a plan. He found Sergeant Collins in the security office and explained the situation. Sir, Collins said, I understand the concern, but we really are stretched thin on personnel this week. Then we need to find a solution, George replied firmly. Officer Mitchell has served this family faithfully for 8 years. When his daughter needs him, we need to support him. George's next stop was his father's office, where he found Prince William reviewing security briefings for an upcoming state visit. Father, I need your help with something urgent, George began, explaining Mitchell's situation and his conviction that the officer needed to be with his family. William listened carefully, recognizing both the compassion and the leadership thinking in his son's request. What do you propose we do about security coverage? I've been thinking about that, George said. What if we temporarily adjusted my schedule to reduce the security requirements? Fewer public appearances, more time in secure areas of the palace. We could manage with reduced coverage for a few days. William smiled at his son's willingness to inconvenience himself for others. That's thoughtful, George, but there might be another solution. Prince William made several phone calls, reaching out to his contacts in royal security. Within 2 hours, he had arranged for temporary coverage from guards who had previously served the royal family and maintained their security clearances. When George found Mitchell to deliver the news, the usually stoic guard nearly broke down with gratitude. Your Royal Highness, I don't know how to thank you, Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. Just take care of Lucy, George replied, and keep us updated on how she's doing. As Mitchell left for the hospital, word of what had happened spread through the palace community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Chef Margaret organized meal deliveries for Mitchell's family. Housekeeping staff pooled resources to send flowers to Lucy's hospital room. Even Lord Pemberton, who had initially opposed the cultural changes at the palace, contributed to a fund to help with any medical expenses. At the hospital, Sarah Mitchell was amazed when deliveries began arriving from Kensington Palace. Food appeared for the family waiting in the hospital. Flowers brightened Lucy's room, and cards arrived from palace staff members whom the Mitchells had never even met. Lucy, though weak from her illness, was thrilled by the attention. Daddy, she whispered from her hospital bed, did the prince really send all this? Yes, sweetheart, James replied, his voice full of wonder at the outpouring of support. Prince George and everyone at the palace wanted you to know they're thinking about you. I want to make him cookies when I get better, Lucy said with determination that made both her parents smile despite their worry. Back at the palace, George found it difficult to concentrate on his studies. He kept thinking about Lucy and wondering about her condition. During his afternoon break, he made an unusual request to his parents. I'd like to visit Lucy in the hospital, he said, if that's possible. Catherine and William exchanged glances. Royal hospital visits were typically formal affairs, carefully planned and heavily secured. But they could see how much this mattered to their son. George, Catherine said gently, that's a beautiful impulse. But hospital visits require significant planning and security arrangements. What if it wasn't an official royal visit? George asked. What if I just went as someone who cares about Lucy and her family? William considered this carefully. It would be highly unusual, but not impossible. We'd need to coordinate with hospital security and keep it very low-key. That evening, arrangements were made for an informal visit. George, accompanied by minimal security and his mother, arrived at the children's hospital just as visiting hours were ending. They had coordinated with the hospital to ensure privacy and minimal disruption. When George walked into Lucy's room, carrying a small bag of homemade cookies from the palace kitchen, the little girl's face lit up with pure joy. You're really him, she exclaimed, then immediately looked embarrassed by her excitement. I'm really me, George said with a smile, pulling up a chair beside her bed. And you're Lucy, the famous cookie expert. For the next 30 minutes, George sat with Lucy and her parents talking about everything except hospitals and illness. He told Lucy about the palace cats, described the gardens where she could play when she visited, and listened to her stories about school and friends. When it was time to leave, Lucy handed George a picture she had drawn while in the hospital. It showed the two of them baking cookies together, with Sarah and James smiling in the background. "When I get better, we'll make this picture real," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "It's a promise," George replied, carefully tucking the drawing into his jacket. Outside in the hospital corridor, James Mitchell struggled to find words adequate for his gratitude. "Your Royal Highness, what you've done for my family. I'll never forget this, James," George said, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You've protected my family for 8 years. We're honored to support yours when you need us." As they left the hospital, Catherine looked at her son with profound pride. In 6 weeks, he had transformed from a teenager learning about protocol to a young man demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired others and created lasting change. The visit to Lucy had been kept private, but word of it spread through the palace community, reinforcing the cultural transformation that had begun with a simple breakfast tray. Staff members saw that the changes weren't just about improved working conditions or better communication. They were about creating a community where everyone truly mattered. 3 months after that transformative morning with the breakfast tray, Lucy Mitchell was declared fully recovered and healthy. Her mysterious illness had turned out to be a severe case of exhaustion and stress-related symptoms, remedied by rest, proper medication, and the overwhelming support that had surrounded her family during the crisis. To celebrate her recovery, Prince George had convinced his parents to arrange something unprecedented, a small, private celebration at Kensington Palace for Lucy and her family. It would be the culmination of all the changes that had begun with one simple act of kindness. On a bright Saturday morning, the Mitchell family arrived at the palace gates, hardly believing this was really happening. Lucy, now fully energetic and excited, wore her best dress and carried a small basket containing ingredients for the chocolate chip cookies she had promised to make with Prince George. Chef Margaret welcomed them into the palace kitchen, which had been specially prepared for the cookie-making session. The usually bustling workspace had been cleared except for one large wooden table surrounded by everything needed for baking. "Are you ready to teach a prince how to make proper cookies?" Margaret asked Lucy with a conspiratorial whisper. Lucy giggled and nodded enthusiastically. "I brought our secret ingredient," she said, reaching into her basket to pull out a small container. "Extra vanilla extract. Daddy says it makes everything taste better." When Prince George arrived in the kitchen, he was followed by an unexpected group. Catherine and William had decided to join the celebration, along with several palace staff members who had contributed to supporting the Mitchell family during Lucy's illness. "Your Royal Highness," Lucy said with a careful curtsy that her mother had taught her. "Are you ready to learn my cookie recipe?" "I'm ready to be your student," George replied with mock seriousness, putting on an apron that Chef Margaret handed him. What followed was one of the most joyful hours in recent palace history. Lucy took her teaching role seriously, instructing George on the proper way to measure flour, the importance of room temperature butter, and the art of not overmixing the dough. No, she said at one point, gently correcting George's technique. "You have to fold the chocolate chips in carefully or they'll sink to the bottom." Catherine and William watched their son taking instruction from a 7-year-old with perfect grace and genuine enjoyment. This was leadership in its purest form, the ability to learn from anyone regardless of age or status. James Mitchell stood to the side, still somewhat overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the scene. His daughter was teaching the future King of England how to bake cookies in the royal kitchen, while other members of the royal family watched and laughed at the proceedings. "James," said Prince William, moving to stand beside him, "your daughter is quite the teacher. She's always been special." "Sir," James replied, his voice full of paternal pride, "but what your family has done for us. I never expected anything like this when I took this job 8 years ago. What we've done is recognize what was already there," William said thoughtfully. "Your dedication, your character, your family's goodness. George just helped us see it more clearly." As the cookies baked, filling the kitchen with their warm, sweet aroma, Lucy entertained everyone with stories about her hospital stay and her plans for when she visited the palace again. "Next time, I want to see the throne room," she announced. And meet the palace cats. And maybe learn how to make royal sandwiches, George laughed. I think we can arrange all of that. But first, we need to see if these cookies meet your standards. When the timer rang and the golden brown cookies emerged from the oven, everyone gathered around as Lucy performed the official taste test. She took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then broke into a huge smile. Perfect, she declared. Prince George is officially a good cookie maker. The celebration was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Lord Pemberton appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying a wrapped package and looking somewhat uncertain. I hope I'm not intruding, he said formally. I wanted to present something to Miss Lucy. Lucy looked up at the distinguished man with curiosity. George quickly made introductions. Lucy, this is Lord Pemberton. He helps make sure everything at the palace runs smoothly. Like a manager? Lucy asked. Exactly like a manager, Pemberton replied, his stern demeanor softening. He handed her the wrapped package. This is something I thought you might enjoy. Inside was a beautifully illustrated book about the history of Kensington Palace, filled with pictures and stories that would captivate a child's imagination. Thank you, Mr. Lord Pemberton, Lucy said politely, then added with innocent directness, Do you like cookies? Pemberton's face transformed with genuine amusement. I do indeed, Miss Lucy. Then you can have one of ours, she said, carefully selecting a perfect cookie from the cooling rack and offering it to him. As Pemberton accepted the cookie with grave ceremony, George realized that this moment represented the complete transformation of palace culture. The man who had initially opposed changes in protocol was now accepting homemade cookies from a 7-year-old girl in the royal kitchen, and everyone present understood that this was exactly as it should be. Later, as the Mitchell family prepared to leave, Lucy had one final surprise. She had drawn another picture during her recovery, and she presented it to George with shy pride. The drawing showed Kensington Palace, but instead of the imposing, formal building most people imagined, Lucy had drawn it as a warm, welcoming place filled with happy people. Guards were smiling, staff members were helping each other, and in the center a prince and a little girl were sharing cookies at a kitchen table. This is how the palace really is, Lucy explained. It's not scary at all. It's full of nice people who care about each other. George studied the drawing carefully, understanding that Lucy had captured something profound. Through the eyes of a child, she had seen the palace not as an institution bound by tradition and hierarchy, but as a community of people connected by kindness and mutual respect. Lucy, George said, this is the most beautiful picture anyone has ever given me. It shows exactly what I hoped our home could become. As the Mitchell family left the palace that day, they carried with them not just memories of an extraordinary experience, but the knowledge that they had been part of something larger, a transformation that had changed not just their own lives, but the very culture of one of Britain's most important institutions. James Mitchell returned to his post the following Monday with renewed dedication, but now it was dedication to more than just duty. He was part of a community that valued him as a person, supported his family in times of need, and recognized that true security came not just from professional vigilance, but from the bonds of mutual care and respect that connected everyone in the palace. Prince George kept Lucy's latest drawing on his desk, where it served as a daily reminder of the leader he wanted to become. The simple act of serving breakfast to a hungry guard had taught him that real power lay not in commanding obedience, but in inspiring others to be their best selves. The story of the breakfast tray had become palace legend, passed down to new staff members as an example of the culture they were joining. It reminded everyone that in a place where tradition and protocol were essential, there was always room for humanity, kindness, and the recognition that every person, regardless of their role, deserved to be seen, valued, and cared for. And sometimes, late at night when the palace was quiet and George was studying for his future role as king, he would remember that morning when everything changed and smile at the knowledge that the most important lesson in leadership had come not from textbooks or formal instruction, but from simply paying attention to the humanity of someone who had been faithfully serving his family all along.